a little bit left of center, those two ideas, but I find them really helpful to feed some slack back into that ankle in ways that potentially other people haven't been looking at. G'day and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to take you through two really effective exercises for posterior ankle impingement. It can often be mistaken or misdiagnosed as Achilles tendonitis. So what we want to do in this video is we want to go through two hopefully really helpful exercises to not only decrease your posterior ankle impingement symptoms, but to hopefully help you get to the cause of why that's jamming up in the first place. But we also need to make sure that you can differentiate between what is a posterior ankle impingement and what is an Achilles tendonitis or an Achilles tendinopathy. If you're going to enjoy this video, please consider leaving a like rating down below. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. If you do find this stuff genuinely helpful, please consider leaving a super thanks donation on the video. It's just a great way to help support the channel and allow me to keep making videos like this. So the first thing we need to do before we even get to these two helpful exercises is we just need to double check that your pain and symptoms are related to a posterior ankle impingement and not something like an Achilles tendonitis or tendinopathy. Now, a great way to begin this assessment basically is to just feel through the tendon. We're looking for things that feel tender. We want to see if we can localize where your pain actually tends to be. So how I'd like you to do this to begin with is we know that the tendon comes from the base of the heel and attaches into your calf muscles. So by starting at the base of that heel, we want to just gently work up either side of that tendon, feeling for any lumps, any tender spots, any sore spots that tell you that you're on the right spot. And then we can come through the back of that tendon as well, doing the same things. It may not necessarily be tender to touch, but in a lot of cases, there is some soreness associated through palpation, whether it is the sheath around the tendon or whether it's the tendon itself. We can feel a lump or a bump or some pain associated with that just by digging our fingers in. And if we go a little bit deeper past the tendon, there is a small chance that you might be able to feel some tenderness at the back of the joint that may also reproduce your symptoms and give you some confidence that you can decipher between a posterior ankle impingement or an Achilles issue going forward. Now, another way to do this is we want to try and take the tendon out of the equation and just get a sense of how the joint feels. And sometimes with a joint that impinges at the back, if you just bend your ankle as far as you feel comfortable and point your toes essentially without trying to activate those muscles, if you do feel like it pinches and it catches a little bit and it does reproduce your symptoms, that may indicate that the posterior aspect of that joint is jamming up and is the source of your pain. If you don't get anything from this, but when you stand up and you start doing some basic movements like a calf raise or some hopping and some jumping in a very comfortable range, if that does then start to generate some of your pain and symptoms, that may lead us to think that the more active motions are reproducing some of your tendonitis or tendinopathy issues, whereas the passive movements like closing down that joint without using your muscles, that may lead you to think it's more of a posterior ankle impingement. The first exercise that I want to go through is an ankle joint mobility exercise, a capsular exercise. Now this will be a little bit different to most ankle mobility exercises that you'll probably see, but in terms of ankle joint impingement and particularly posterior ankle joint impingement, we need to have a really strong conversation or a really good look at the actual capsular restriction of that ankle, which can often be one of the main reasons why that joint is jamming up, why it's catching, why it's impinging, and all the superficial muscular stretches may be for nothing if we aren't getting to the deeper root restriction that might be causing that ankle to jam up in the first place. So the way that I really like to do this is by using a band of some sort. So this is a power band or a jump stretch band, depending on what you like to call them. I've fixated this to something that's not going to move. Now we're going to do a banded ankle stretch. Now the traditional ankle stretch that we do is one where we have the band either below or above the ankle, depending on where you feel comfortable. We have the band behind us, we stretch it out, and then we bend that back ankle as far as we feel comfortable. And what this does, this tends to stretch the posterior capsule of the ankle, and it's often fantastic for anterior ankle joint impingement. So ultimately what we want to do here is we want to turn this around a little bit and try and figure out a way to open up the capsule at the front of the ankle, which might be causing the back of your ankle to jam up. Now I'll switch feet just so that you can see this a bit easier. But one way that I really like to do this is I like to put you into plantar flexion, so have as much tension on the band as you feel comfortable. Now, there's two ways that you can do this in particular. You can have your toes on the ground and then just gently let your ankles straighten as far as you feel comfortable. You can maneuver your leg around just so that the band is pulling in a direction that you feel is really tight or really restricted. And you'll hopefully feel some tightness at the front of the ankle here. And you can play around with the direction that you feel you need this in based on where you feel the restriction may be. But to really ramp it up a little bit further, if you curl your toes and allow your ankle to bend even further, we can use some of the leverage that we can create by having our feet and our ankle on the ground to really force ourselves respectfully into more plantar flexion and open up the front of that ankle joint more. Now, obviously be very gentle because we are closing down the back of the ankle here. So if you do have some pretty sinister posterior ankle impingement symptoms, it might be better for you to start in a more gentle, respectful way, make some subtle progress at the front, then as that has a chain reaction of positivity through your ankle, as things start to normalize mechanically, you might find you can push it a little bit further based on how you feel. So don't go too hard too early, just in case closing down the back of the ankle impinges your ankle further and makes it feel uncomfortable. But by doing this, I'm getting a really, really nice stretch through the front of that ankle joint. And then when releasing that, it all of a sudden feels like my ankle is now more mobile because what I've done is I've biased the ankle joint capsule at the front of the ankle, opened up the front of the ankle to allow more space and more mechanical normality through the back of the ankle. Now, with any ankle impingement, whether it's anterior or posterior ankle joint impingement, most people's joint capsules can generally be stiff. So you might need to do both versions of that stretch in terms of hitting the back of the ankle joint and the front of the ankle joint, and then reassess your symptoms to see which one has the biggest impact. But I find clinically that the last one that we did, where you come up onto your toes and are pulling through the front of that joint, can really help feed a lot of mechanical slack around the back of that joint and stop it from impinging and causing some pain. So the second exercise that I want to touch on is another unique take on some structures that might be changing the way that you're loading your ankle and feeding into that posterior ankle impingement type mechanism. Now, what we tend to know is if the tissue at the front is restricted, we saw that with the ankle mobility, where if the tissue at the front is restricted, it doesn't give as much room for the tissue at the back to move, and you're more likely to jam that tissue up as opposed to express that more normally because the front is giving. So what we can also find here is not only does the capsule at the front tend to be stiff, but a lot of the soft tissue over the top can also be restricted. So whether that is that tibialis anterior or some of the tissue more laterally, where some of the perineal tissue, we want to see if we can find any tissue that feels restricted, try and feed some slack back into the ankle from the front. Now, a great way to do that is with a roller or a ball of some sort. Now, I would recommend using a tennis ball to begin with because it can be quite tender to do this. You can use a peanut if you've got 2 tennis balls or 2 lacrosse balls. You can tape those together to create a little bit of a cradle for your shin to sit on while you're trying to sort of figure out where that restriction is through the front there. But this is often missed because it's the front of the shin, front of the foot and ankle. We tend to focus so much more on the back of the ankle through the calf. There's a lot more musculature through there. And for some reason, we neglect the tissue at the front a little bit more. So if you have a posteriorly impinging ankle, we really want to put a lot of time into figuring out where you're restricted through the front here to feed some slack back into the back of that ankle to help restore some normality to that tissue. A great way to do this, again, we can show you this with the roller, is as advertised. We basically just want to place the roller on the front of your shin, maybe a little bit to the side, depending on where you feel you need to be. You can have your other leg out if you want to really manage how much tension you put through there. And all I want to get you to do is just move the roller up and down, looking for something that feels restricted. So you might, as I said, need to come a little bit more towards the side of the ankle, not directly on the side, but more sort of on a 45-degree angle there. Go looking for something that feels restricted, and then move down a little bit on the roller. Being mindful that you're not putting all your pressure through your shin bone. Try and find where things feel tight and restricted. And then what I want you to do here, and I'll do this just so you can see, is once you've found a spot that feels a little bit tight, I want to get you to then pump your foot. So we're putting some pressure through the tissue, And then what I want you to do is, while that tension is on the tissue, then gently bend and straighten out your ankle to shear that tissue free. So we might be, de-adhering some stuck sliding surfaces. We're just encouraging more motion at the joint. It's always hard to know whether the muscle tissue is giving a little bit, or the fascia is giving, or whatever it might be, or whether it's just a neural relaxation that's happening here. But we know that by putting some gentle pressure on a tight spot and incorporating movement through that tissue, it really helps restore a lot more normality to that motion in a very short amount of time. Now, the other way that we can do this, which again might be a little bit better for you depending on how uncomfortable that was to do, is we can use a tennis ball or a lacrosse ball or your fingers to go looking through those same spots. So again, a great way to do that is just to have the ball into your shin, and we want to come up as high as possible, because remember, particularly that tib-ant muscle, it sits at the front of your shin here, goes all the way down and crosses the front of that ankle. So anything through the front there can get restricted, fascia or soft tissue. So you just want to dig in, go looking for what you find. Again, we don't want you to roll around too much. You can dig in and then move your foot around. So start with your foot. So starting with your foot bent back, find a spot that feels a little bit tight. So I found one here, put some pressure through there, and then straighten that foot out, and you'll feel like you're really shearing some of that tissue free. And then what will happen is, after a very short amount of time, it'll stop feeling as restricted, it'll stop feeling as tender, and it'll move a little bit better. And then again, if you have those symptoms or those activities that you know irritate your ankle, whether it's jumping or hopping or doing something like that, then recheck those movements just to see the impact that you're having on the back of that ankle. So again, I think ultimately what gets missed a lot with posterior ankle impingement is that the structures at the front of the ankle can often become stiff, tight, and restricted, and mechanically that has a strong effect on how the back of that ankle is functioning and can cause it to jam up if you're not being careful. So I hope that was really, really helpful. They're a little bit left of center, those two ideas, but I find them really helpful to feed some slack back into that ankle in ways that potentially other people haven't been looking at. So it's obviously important to note that there are a bunch of other things that are important to do. We do want to make sure your calves are functioning normally. We want to make sure that you're nice and strong everywhere else. Flexibility, strength, and good loading is the same for any issues. So obviously those two exercises on their own need to be done in conjunction with a very well-tailored exercise program. But those two exercises specifically I find very helpful for most people with posterior ankle impingement. So with that being said, please leave a like on the video if you found that helpful. Chuck us a super thanks donation if you did find this really made an impact on your symptoms. Subscribe to the channel, but we'll see you in the next one.